Welcome. I'm Dr. Berkson, and this is Dr. Berkson's Best Health Radio Show. I love to have agile thinkers on my show so you can get in on these conversations and get the exact answers to protect your health. It seems like this month is Brain Month. There's so many brain summits going on because people are realizing that we feel through our brain, see through our brain, fear through our brain, that your health and it's that how you evolve and move through your life inside your bodysuit really depends on your brain. And so today's show is with one of the best brain experts that there are. You should sit on the edge of your seat because I'm so excited to have this guest today. You know, there's not only a lot of brain summits, there's a lot of brain songs. I went online and there are songs called Brain Fever, Brain Salad Surgery, Maggot Brain, Brain Capers, Who's Been Sleeping in My Brain? I love all that. But we have, as such an honor, on this show today, a huge player that put the term grain brain into the public health consciousness. We have a functional medicine neurologist. I think he's really one of the only true functional medicine neurologists in the United States, if not the world. And there's several reasons I'm so excited to have him on the show. Besides, he's the medical director for Dr. Oz, and he's won all these awards, and he's been multiply on the best New York Times bestseller book list. But I have a personal link with him. I have a best friend named Dr. Carol Roberts, who is also a functional medicine doctor after having been a surgeon earlier on in her life. And she worked with Dr. Perlmutter. And she said to me, Lindsey, he is the real deal. He gets along great with his patients. He's easy to work with. The office runs like butter. He lives and walks his talk. He does a ketogenic diet. He's healthy as can be. Everything around him has smooth, workable energy. He is the real deal. You know, there's not a lot of people who really walk the smart plus heart line. And when you meet somebody like that, it gives you hope. So we have a huge player in functional medicine today who is the real deal and who's going to give you a lot of hope and a lot of answers. So let me get through his bio here. And if I did the whole entire bio, we'd be here for 2 hours before you could even hear him talk. But he's a board certified neurologist and a 4-time New York Times bestseller. As I just said, he's the medical advisor for the Dr. Oz show. And he's received, this is huge, the 2002 Linus Pauling. My clinic in Palo Alto used to be around the corner from Linus Pauling's lab, the only guy who won 2 Nobel Prizes. And we'd go take a brown paper bag lunch over there and hang out with him. But Dr. Perlmutter won this coveted 2002 Linus Pauling Award. And he also won the 2006 National Nutritional Foods Association Award. And he was awarded the Communications and Media Award from the American College of Nutrition. I remember that he wrote an article in Medscape, and it was called Dementia, Is Gluten the Real Culprit? Now, Medscape is an online medical journal that goes out to about 5 million medical practitioners all around the world, and it's pretty conservative, and it's sponsored by Big Pharma. His article was the most read article on Medscape ever. I mean, ever. This is really huge that we have him on the show today. Now, he wrote the book that he's most famous for called The Grain Brain. It's not one of the songs like the Caper Brain or the Maggot Brain. It's the book called The Grain Brain. And he promoted the concept that gluten causes neurologic conditions. And that book became a bestseller. And we're going to ask him a lot about gluten and what it means and how he became a rogue neurologist and so forth, because we've got so much to talk with him about. He received his medical degree from the University of Miami School of Medicine, where he won another award, the Leonard G. Roundtree Research Award, and he served as a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, so he's all about protecting your brain. And he's a frequent lecturer at symposia at really prestigious and elegant institutions like Columbia, Scripps, New York University, Harvard University, and he serves as an associate professor at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. His works have been published in 30 languages. I've got almost 21 books out, and my books have not been published in almost 30 languages. That's huge. That means that his voice and his message is so resounding and holds so many answers that we're lucky to have him on the show today. So his New York Times bestsellers, just to mention a few, have been The Grain Brain, The Surprising Truth About Wheat, Carbs, and Sugar, which we're going to talk about, and that's over 1 million copies in print. He's got The Grain Brain Whole Life Plan, and it looks like he's even got a TV special on that. And he's been on so many nationally syndicated television programs, including 2020, Larry King Live, CNN, Fox News, The Today Show, Oprah. I got to hear how it was hanging out with Oprah. He is the medical director of Dr. Oz, but he's also been on the Dr. Oz show, and he's also been on the CBS Early show. So we get to hear today what he has to share with us how to take care of ourselves. Now, I had Dr. Joseph Pizzarno, who really was the spearhead of Bastyr Naturopathic College and a good friend of mine, on this show. But I want to read to you, just before we bring Dr. Perlmutter on, I'm so excited to have David here, what Dr. Pizzarno said about Dr. Perlmutter. He said, Dr. Perlmutter is the leading integrative medicine neurologist in North America today, and I would add to that, even in the world. His ability to fully integrate conventional medicine diagnosis and treatment with the latest innovations in nutritional and environmental medicine is phenomenal. He used the term, and Joseph is not prone to hyperbole. As a teacher and clinician, he has fundamentally changed how physicians and patients think about neurologic degeneration and, happily, regeneration. So welcome to the show, Dr. Perlmutter.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be here today.
I am so excited. So I have so many questions to ask you because it's so special that we have you here. How did you happen to go what I call rogue in neurology, that you left the allopathic straight and narrow road and you saw the light of a bigger global nutritional picture?
Truthfully, I've been asked that question before. I've reflected upon that question many times. I was just very dissatisfied with, I think, our lack of accomplishment as mainstream neurologists, pretty much focused on the notion of diagnose and adios. You know, we were really great at applying a name to something. You know, sometimes they were very obscure. Other times it was pretty straightforward, Alzheimer's or MS or what have you. But once we made a diagnosis, that seemed to me like all we did, and that the job was done. And I then did not think that my medical training was being fully utilized if that's all I could offer somebody was a name for their problem. So I began to recognize, by looking at good science, good peer-reviewed literature, that there already was, 30 years ago, the beginnings of an indication that, for example, our lifestyle choices impacted the destiny of the brain. And even back then, we would see research that individuals, for example, who engaged in exercise, who slept adequately, would have decreased risk for brain degeneration. We learned that low vitamin D seemed to be associated with risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and certainly multiple sclerosis. So, you know, these things were talked about, but I wanted to take it further and leverage this evolving data in terms of treatment protocols for real live patients. Because while it was well and good that these studies were coming out, they were coming out for a reason. And they would all these research studies would end by saying, well, further research needs to be done.
Right, they all end with that. It's
they
crazy,
do.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens in the next 20 years. That was never good enough for me, because I was seeing patients that afternoon, and I was going to bring this information to bear, right or wrong. So I began to implement these integrative or functional approaches to actual clinical practice, getting people's vitamin D levels where they needed to be, changing diets. And, you know, these were years and years ago when there were very few rogues out there. I mean, you had the opportunity
give me a
yourself.
little bit. So give me the time frame. When did you start doing that in your practice?
This is probably 25 at least years ago, when people like Alan Gaby and Leo Galland,
Alan's one of my brothers, and Leo and I have hung out and designed some nutraceuticals together.
Well, I mean, this was the very early days.
Right.
And it was by meeting individuals like that and realizing that, there are other people in the world who are thinking along the same lines, that we've got to push and we've got to identify new playing fields in which to confront these devastating illnesses, because the mainstream notion of waiting for somebody to not function cognitively and then tell them to hope for the best wasn't working for me, and certainly wasn't working for other people in the area. So the more I got involved in it, the more excited I became, because we were really starting to make inroads in treating illnesses that previously did not have anything in the textbooks that we could typically use.
Can you share what some of your very early wins were about?
Early on, I was very much involved in MS and Parkinson's, and we developed protocols for those and other diseases that I think were clearly very effective. And I learned that by teaching our protocols to other physicians along the way, I could hear back from them in terms of their results as well, which were really very, very positive. So I was in a very traditional mainstream neurology practice for my first 10 years out of residency. And I finally had an epiphany with my wife, and I said, I'm just not going to do it anymore. And we decided to take a one night away from our children, and we went up to Sanibel Island, a little hotel room on the beach. We walked along and said, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to open up my own practice. What's the worst that could happen? And it was wonderful. It opened up so many doors. I got to meet so many wonderful people along the way, incredible patients along the way, and, got to participate in the development of the functional medicine paradigm, integrative healthcare symposia, various venues that have since become fairly commonplace for people like yourself and for me. But in the early days, these were really out there, and they weren't as well attended, certainly, as they are now. So it was exciting to be part of those days, when Dr. Pizzorno was starting Bastyr and all that. And now, there's a big segment of people who are being listened to because in many ways, science has followed them and has validated what we've been saying for a very long time.
So, for example, when you were in practice, I know you've ended private practice, and I'm going to ask you why you decided to make that decision, I think in March of the year before last. So when Carol was practicing with you, I would call her up and I would say, I would just love to know some of the really cool, they're kind of like neurologic functional recipes, but they were protocols that you designed when other people didn't have answers, or the only answers were suffering or meds, and cross your fingers that the meds might work. For example, she shared with me your shingles protocol, which I promptly used on the next 5 or 6 patients that walked in, and it worked as advertised in 2 days when people had been suffering for 8 months or longer and really had so much pain they didn't want to go on. I don't know if you want to share that protocol, but how did you go from being open to looking at a new way and developing these out-of-the-box protocols?
Well, certainly trial and error had a lot to do with it. But beyond that, there are people who are publishing information that don't always appear in the most well-respected read journals like New England Journal and JAMA, et cetera. People, for example, like Dr. Alan Gaby would publish these obscure studies, and I would latch onto those. And, as it relates to post-herpetic neuralgia, which is, I think, what you're getting at, it was very clear that there were some significant advantages to a compilation of topicals that were anti-inflammatory, that were specifically designed to reduce pain. We even added into that Elavil because of its ability to reduce a certain chemical in the area and the transmission of a certain chemical, along with injections of what many would consider fairly high dosages of a form of vitamin B12 called methylcobalamin. So what you're hearing me say is that it wasn't a magic bullet per se. It was like Dr. Dale Bredesen talks about magic buckshot. where we would bring multiple ideas to bear, and that way, try to leave no stone unturned. And I think that really sets up for an interesting conversation, doesn't it? That, we practice generally in medicine these days in Western countries looking for the one answer for the problem, whether it's an Alzheimer's pill or the drug to reduce cholesterol or whatever it may be, as opposed to recognizing that it's often much better to bring multiple factors in line and watch the body heal itself. And I'd say that, that certainly is a shift from the idea of having one magic pill.
It's kind of like when you design a drug. I designed a drug with a nephrologist here in town, and when we went to the derm division of the FDA, they only want you to have ideally one active, and we had one of the first herbal pharma combinations, so they allowed us to have a little bit more active. But to really do the job right, effectively and inexpensively, we actually needed multiple actives, but because Big Pharma is set up to really take non-humanoid molecules through the whole regulatory process, you can't really do it that way in medicine, which is why it's great that you're doing it that way in functional medicine.
Well, again, as it relates to Alzheimer's disease, you don't get Alzheimer's disease because one thing went wrong.
Right.
It's not because you have the APOE4 allele. It's not because you have a high burden of beta amyloid or phosphorylated tau in your brain. Many things conspire to ultimately bring about a disease like Alzheimer's. And that tells you a couple things. First, it tells you that your body has a backup plan, backup mechanisms that should one thing go wrong, there's still other things in place that can help protect you. But it also very fully explains why the one drug mentality fails miserably as it relates to Alzheimer's disease, and that the effective way of going about a treatment protocol for something as devastating as Alzheimer's has to look at multiple inroads, maximizing or optimizing various biomarkers, optimizing vitamin D, lowering homocysteine, increasing the availability of ketones, leveraging the very powerful effects of exercise in humans, reducing gluten, for example, a diet that's lower in sugar, recognizing the importance of dietary fat, making sure sleep is optimal in the middle of the U-shaped curve, not too little and not too late.
Right, I just saw your
Goldilocks
blog.
Mentality.
I saw your blog that if you start sleeping too much, this might be suggestive of early neurodegeneration.
Yeah, we tend to, and I'm perhaps guilty of that, think that if some is good, more is clearly going to be better. It isn't that way in biological systems. There's a sweet spot. There's the Goldilocks mentality. This bed was too hard, this bed was too soft, but this one was just right, and the porridge being the right temperature. So as it relates, for example, to alcohol consumption, 1 glass of wine for women, 2 glasses for men seems to be most associated with reduced risk of dementia, of developing dementia, whereas less than that might not be as good for you, and clearly more than that is also detrimental. So we really have to start getting into the mindset of a sweet spot as it relates to physical exercise.
So can I ask you a question about that? I'd love to know this. So can the sweet spot be different from person to person? Like some people are great at 8 hours of sleep and some people are great at 5. My mother lived to be in her mid-90s and she only slept 4 hours a night sleep like Einstein did, and many of the indigenous societies sleep 4 hours a night, then wake up in the middle of the night and have a meal with everybody with the lights on and then go back to sleep, whereas we say it should be totally dark in 8 hours. Can you chat about that biochemical individuality?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, there is a huge push these days for what is called personalized medicine, where we try to gain as much information about an individual, about his or her genetics, about his or her biometrics, various metabolic studies that we can do, looking at these changes over time, looking at their microbiomes, looking at their heritage, and try to leverage this data and crunch this data in such a way as to be able to make meaningful recommendations that are very individualized. So you're right. One size does not fit all. On the other hand, I think we do recognize that there are some broad stroke recommendations that we can make to the population at large. We know pretty much that sniffing glue is not a good thing, whether you do a lot or a little.
Oh, darn,
some
I'm
things
going to
are
have to
off the scale.
Going to have to stop that bad habit.
But as it relates to sleep, I think your point is well taken, that what is the best recommendation for you might be different for what might be the best recommendation for the next person. But I think that's the beauty of looking at these large studies that look at thousands of people and try to, again, make these broad scope recommendations in terms of, just the ideas, for example, which I think challenges some people, that having a lot of sleep under your belt every night might also not necessarily be the right thing. We know that exercise is really important for your health and certainly very important for your brain, but we also know that you can overdo it. So I think it's, to get back to the thesis here, and that is one that states that there really is an area in the middle of the curve where we should endeavor to place ourselves as it relates to various choices. Are there subtle variations that change from individual to individual? You bet there are. And I think we as physicians have to be sensitive that we don't dig our feet in the sand and say, you've got to do this. You've got to have a blood sugar of X, a fasting insulin of Y. We've got to drive your cholesterol down into the ditch because that's what the science says is good for you. We have to realize that a lot of these recommendations have come to us from pharmaceutical interests who want us to behave in a certain way.
That is a really great question, that you had all this medical training and you felt that it wasn't really giving you the right answers because patients weren't getting well the way you wanted to. So you were open to looking outside of what your training had been, which was enormous. Why is your training enormous and it's stopping at the diagnosis and you're not getting people well or getting them even preventatively well before they get ill? And I had done my first rotation in integrative medicine in 1977 with Dr. Alan Gaby. He and I were both students, and it was with Dr. Jonathan Wright. And Dr. Wright had files and files of thousands of references of articles where he delved into the peer review literature to get pearls and then translate those science pearls into the clinical arena like you are discussing. And so Alan has gone forth as his career, with his book, Nutritional Medicine and so forth, and has done such a beautiful job of it as you have. And all of us love to be agile thinkers and say, how do we keep someone well, identify if they're at risk of getting ill and getting them well once and for all if they are ill? Why is it that so many people, you have to be really smart to go to med school, you have to endure a lot and have discipline to go through med school, and you get out on the other side, and there's only so many people who think like that. They kind of get Velcroed to the algorithmic approach and keeping up the mainstream issue, where in Health Affairs published last week, I think it showed that out of 19 westernized countries, if you're a child in the U.S., you have 76% more risk of dying within the first year compared to the 19 other countries, yet we spend 20% of our gross national product on the medicine that we're talking about. So can you chat about why you left and so many other people with all that training and smarts aren't doing that?
Sure. And let me first say that I am eternally grateful for my mainstream medical training, neurology training, and experiences because they serve me to this day. You have to understand that. You have to understand what's being offered there, because I think it's certainly unfair to derogate the entire system. It has some very strong upsides that we use every single day. That said, when you're looking face to face with a patient and his or her family, eye contact, and they ask you a simple question, doctor, what else do you think? What else can we do? To confront that moment by saying, well, there really isn't anything else, I think is really unfair. And it means you haven't done your homework. You could say, well, there really isn't anything else in mainstream medicine that I'm aware of. And that, I think, is not fulfilling your pledge. I think that when we recognize that mainstream medicine does not have all the answers, it is humbling, but it's also extremely empowering because you have to be willing to accept that fact and willing to cross over and embrace new and novel information, which may or may not be correct, but beyond that does not have this degree of validation to support it that taking the latest drug for blood pressure might have. But I think it's it's part of the oath you take to do everything you possibly can to help that patient who's looking you in the face beyond what the ads in medical journals would tell you should do. I think our son is just finishing internal medicine as a resident, and he fully understands how the system works in terms of residents coming out of their residency programs being really fairly manipulated to toe the line, practice under accepted guidelines, which generally involves using specific medications and treatment protocols that are developed by interests that in those protocols, in those drugs. He gets it, and many people get it. So I think that to be the very best you can. Certainly in your life, you've experienced this, and to take the lemons and make lemonade. To look at adversity and ask yourself, what windows has this adversity opened for me in terms of opportunities to understand things from a different perspective? When your mother was exposed to DES, and you then learned about that. That was you did the right thing. You learned about what that meant and the possible health consequences of that for your mother, for yourself. And instead of just moving on, you explored it and helped a lot of people after the fact by that adversity. So I think we're called upon to look at things in a broader way, as opposed to simply being very myopic, as our medical education would want us to be.
Boy, I'm so touched that you know about my history and you shared that, like you really took time to find out my back copy for us to have this really great agile conversation. It means a whole lot to me. And I wasn't denigrating, just to be really clear, allopathic education. That is my confusion, is that these people are so smart. And they do get such a fabulous education. And then it seems that when they go to the office, their pledge isn't met, what you said. And it's really been more confusing to me when I had all my issues that continued to go on because of this in utero exposure. I bump into that a lot. So thank you so much. Boy, you really are the real deal. So,
well, let me go back and comment, if I may, for just a moment. I mean, I think that doctors have this sense that if I study hard in college and get into medical school, and if I get into medical school and do well and get into the residency program, and when I finish my residency program, I'll be out there, the world will respect me, and all I have to do is show up 8 hours a day and write prescriptions, and I'll make a lot of money, and I'll be practicing evidence-based medicine in the world. That's it. And a lot of people do that, and that's before they know it, 30, 40 years have gone by and they retire, and that's what they did. It doesn't fulfill, in my case, the inquisitiveness of the curiosity of what's going on, what else is out there. And with allopathic medical training as a foundation, I think it really sets you up to be inquisitive and to really leverage your curiosity, hopefully for better patient outcome.
How many other functional neurologists do you think are out there? Because when we try and find them here in town, we can't find them very easily.
I know Dr. Terry Walls, Dr. Dale Bredesen, and then there's Dr. Terry Walls, and there's Dr. Dale Bredesen and me, and there you go. I hope I didn't leave anybody out. But in terms of being an MD, who embraces this information, I think the list is pretty small. But truthfully, I was very lonesome there for a long time until other people started to show up. So, I think, to be fair, neurology is really a field that doesn't perfectly lend itself to embracing, these kind of alternative or integrative notions. I think that the idea of integrative medicine in a field, for example, like cardiology, I think the path was paved for that. So, cardiology is an area where diet and exercise have really been fundamentally important for a couple of decades. So we see a fair number of integrative or functional cardiologists. I think endocrinology, as it relates to things like diabetes, lends itself very, very well. Other areas as well. We still see very little in the way of functional medicine as it relates to ophthalmology, and certainly as it relates to psychiatry as well, but I think that will come along.
Right. Ophthalmology has so much to do with antioxidants and keeping rich pigments in the eye because color protects the eye. But in fact, I had Robert Rich on the show. He's one of the top ophthalmologists. And I'm going to have Dr. Alan Cranston, who's a major ophthalmologist from the Moran Eye Institute. But it was one of the questions I was going to ask you. So I'll hop to that. So glaucoma, which is a disease of the optic nerve, and it's a leading cause of blindness, is often referred to as dementia of the eye. You are the functional neurologist helping us all prevent our risk of dementia, even if we have the allele, the vulnerability risk allele. So can you comment at all about treatments that you've done with people with glaucoma?
Well, I think I would look more to macular degeneration as being more aligned with the whole degenerative free radical mediated process of degeneration. And I think that, when we see the AREDS study that looks at giving a certain cocktail of antioxidants and minerals being somewhat effective, it opens up our minds to the notion that free radical mediated stress is not confined to the eye, to the brain, to the heart, to the immune system, that these issues that confront the body are systemic issues. And the eye might be a marker for elevated activity of free radicals and be indicative that there are changes happening elsewhere in the body as well. We learn this information from the understanding that changes in the gut, for example, specifically as they relate to the gut bacteria and permeability of the gut, relate to the process of inflammation that can affect any organ system in the body, including the brain, including the heart, and even including immune balance. So, it gets us to an understanding of the body as an integrated whole, which certainly flies in the face of medical specialists who want to concentrate on how various medications and diet, et cetera, might affect one body part. We recognize that the body is integrated, that this notion of reductionism, recognizing the brain is your laptop, your heart is a pump, the lungs are a bellows, et cetera, really is old news. And we've got to move past that, especially as it relates to things going on within the gut and how the gut then, those changes affect other parts of the body, including an area far away from the gut called the brain. So I'm very honored that I'm editor-in-chief of a new book coming out called The Microbiome and the Brain, in which we have authors from Harvard, Oxford, UCLA, MIT, who are all coming together, each contributing a chapter to really look at this beautiful connection that was only just recognized, only just very recently by Dr. Hippocrates. So we've known this stuff for a long time, and it's only been in the past century that there's been this real push to segregate the body into its constituent parts and to, again, recognize the body as being quite separate, not only within itself, organ systems, but also certainly separate from our communities and our society in general.
Well, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions on the brain-gut connection, but I want to go back for a second where you were talking about antioxidants. So if the body is a global whole, like a planet unto itself, how do you know when you have a balance between oxidative and antioxidative and pro-oxidative functions? Because, for example, now many doctors use ozone to treat a lot of conditions, and ozone is a pro-oxidant. So can you comment on that?
Sure. I think that the use of ozone and even hyperbaric oxygen really fall in line with what we call hormesis, and that is a low level of stress that does actually induce some very positive things in the human body, like the turning on, or what we call upregulation, of the production of certain positive things like antioxidants and inflammation-reducing chemicals. We know that oxygenation, whether it's through ozone or hyperbarics, does tend to provide to the mitochondria an important part of their metabolism, which is the oxygen story. But I think that, again, this relates to the fact that stressing the body in some way, whether it's caloric restriction, sleep restriction, having higher levels of oxygenation, oftentimes lets the body respond in a way that takes care of the problem and then some. For example, if you go to the gym and you do curls, what do? You actually tear some of the fibers in your biceps muscle. Your body will repair that back to the level of where those fibers were, and then a little bit more to prepare you for the future. So I think that's a kind of a good analogy as to how some of these therapies work. As it relates to overall redox balance, or the balance between oxidative stress and antioxidants, if you will, I think that first we should state that oxidative stress is a very good thing, that it's part of who we are, and that we channel these free radicals to serve us, to help the body, for example, rid itself of certain invaders, for example, or destroy certain things called that are encapsulated within cells, that we are able to get rid of these things through the actions of free radicals.
You mean like viruses or things like that? Is that
exactly. Inflammation as well. It's actually obviously a very positive event. We just have to limit the degree of inflammation so it doesn't go unchecked.
The Goldilocks principle once again.
Absolutely. The difference between building bone cells and breaking down bone cells, osteoblastic activity versus osteoclastic activity. We want to have ultimately a little bit more bone building than bone breakdown. Same thing happens in the brain, that we have the destruction of brain cells, and at the same time we're growing new brain cells and making new synapses. Synaptogenesis versus synaptoclastic activity. So having said that, I think there may be a bit of an overzealous push to load us up with antioxidants. I think pretty much the body deals with a normal level of free radical mediated stress under normal conditions.
So you're saying we can get too many antioxidants?
Well, I think that the issue is, let me just contextualize this, that we have this balance that served us for the past 200,000 years or so. But suddenly we are now confronted by much higher levels of free radical mediated stress, that our ability to produce antioxidants within our bodies and our ability to consume them in the foods we eat naturally have been diminished. So I think that said, the degree of challenge to human physiology by our toxic environment, to me, speaks to the idea of meeting it toe-to-toe by having an extra layer of antioxidants on board in terms of supplementation, be it orally, certainly having antioxidant-rich foods, engaging in using various spices and other foods, for example, that turn on various gene pathways to make antioxidants within your body. For example, using turmeric in your curry cooking, because turmeric activates a specific pathway called the NRF2 pathway that upregulates your body's natural ability to make antioxidants. So, these are pathways that have been there for a long, long time, and we're just beginning to understand how we can manipulate them in our favor.
Boy, we live in such a complex world. I was taking a walk around Quarry Lake in my neighborhood with one of my good girlfriends who's a family practice doc. She'd been 12 years a family practice doc at Austin Regional Clinic, and then she went and took Dr. Wild's 2.5-year certification course in functional medicine, and now she just opened her doors this year. And she's from India. She's a beautiful young woman, and she had a patient who had premature ovarian failure early on in life and can't get pregnant. And of course, now has so many other health risk factors because it's menopause way too early. And because she's Indian and this woman, she realized, had been consuming a lot of turmeric, she started to sleuth. And she discovered that this woman was sent her herbs from her Indian family from India, where the herbs are sold based on the weight. They get so much more money if the herb weighs more. So they were adding lead to the herb.
Oh my gosh.
When she measured even her blood, which usually you have to do a provocation study, she did just a blood level. Her lead was many-fold elevated. And she called up the poison center here in Austin. She said, there's all these PhDs just sitting around doing nothing, only glad to help. Long story short, a lot of turmeric out there is laden with lead. So you want to get knowledge like you're sharing to upregulate your antioxidant capabilities, but you also want to be prudent with where you purchase these resources.
Oh, no question. And, as it relates to food, we're always, very much in line recommending non-GMO and organic. But I think that as it relates to nutritional supplements, it's doubly important that you make sure that these are certified organic. But I often think that it's a better choice to use the spice, in this case the rhizome of turmeric, curcumin, in your cooking. It just seems it's better. I certainly feel that it doesn't have that level of processing. So the idea of adding something to taint it, if you're just using the rhizome like you would for turmeric or for ginger, I think it just seems to make more sense.
Well, you have a cookbook that's come out with your Grain Brain book. So what's one of your favorite turmeric-laden recipes that you love?
Well, there's a great recipe for salmon that has a mustard glaze that has obviously turmeric in it. And I'm going to tell you, Lindsey, I'm not the world's best cook, chef, as it were. But I can do that one along with the cauliflower mashed potato type thing. And I've cooked that dinner a number of times for my wife and for her mother, who is a bit critical about food as well. And so I pulled it off. So that's probably one of my favorites. And I love salmon.
Oh, I do too. And I love to cook. In fact, usually when I'm in a relationship, I say the kitchen is my domain, one of my few domains. If you want, you can help wash, but I want to do everything because I love to make organic, healthy food taste like you're sinning. That's one of my really favorite things. It just gives me joy. If I'm all stressed out, I go into the kitchen and create, and it makes me feel good. But how did you get on the road of gluten awareness? How did you go from not knowing that to suddenly writing a book that changed so many people's consciousness, coming out with your article in Medscape, Dementia, is gluten the real culprit? How did all that happen, David?
Well, Grain Brain was published 5 years ago. And actually, I just completed the manuscript for the 5-year anniversary revision, which should be out soon. And at that time, we were seeing a lot of patients with celiac disease, and we began to see literature from England that was looking at some of the non-intestinal consequences of gluten sensitivity. And this is before we actually learned of the term non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So there was a lot of work being done by researchers. They had a big symposium in England where they began to describe extraintestinal manifestations of gluten sensitivity. Things like neurological issues, which obviously caught my attention, headache, movement disorders, cognitive issues, children with disability with respect to being able to focus, etc. Many neurologic issues as extraintestinal manifestations. And I puzzled over that, thinking, well, most people are considering gluten sensitivity through the lens of the GI doctor, that, well, I have an upset stomach, I might be sensitive to dairy, to gluten, you name it. But that said, we began putting people on gluten-free diets who did not have gastrointestinal issues. And I began publishing work about treatment of headache, etc., with a Dr. Vojdani, about gluten sensitivity being related to headache, for example, and began get great success in dealing with some challenging neurological issues by taking gluten out of the diet. So I wrote the book, and in Grain Brain, as you know, we talk about many of our cases, but we talk about the global experience. We talk about the under-discussed clinical publications that have come out talking about gluten. that completely unrelated to celiac disease, that now is getting widespread recognition. And the other part of the book, though, I think really called the notion of our carbohydrate consumption to task. And this was still 5 years ago when people were still thinking a low-fat diet was a good idea. When you would walk down the grocery store shelves and you'd see low-fat Oreos or you name it, low-fat, but that would mean eat.
Low-fat sour cream, low-fat cheese, right.
You bet. And, again, a diet unlike anything humans had ever consumed. What's happened over recent years, I think, has really validated our initial contentions. We now see research from Harvard showing that gluten causes gut permeability in all humans. Not that 1.8% with celiac disease or maybe the 20% who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but experimentally, all humans have an increase in the permeability of their gut when exposed to gliadin, which is a protein found in gluten, found in wheat, barley, and rye.
Is that because the plant produces all of these gliadin molecules as a way of protection out in the wild? So if animals or birds eat it...
Well, we don't know, if there's a conscious awareness that the wheat plant, the wheat plant domesticated humans about 10,000 years ago. So we were domesticated by the wheat plant, allowing the wheat plant decided it wanted to spread around the world, so it chose humans to domesticate, and humans have been the pawn.
I like this reframe. Very cool reframe.
Yeah. So that said, the other important part of the study was the sugar part, and that's when a lot of the research was coming out, really beginning to castigate sugar in terms of its role in inflammation, its relationship to risk for dementia, by looking at fasting blood sugar and then following individuals for 7 years, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, September 2013, showing that the best predictor, one of the best predictors of future dementia is fasting blood sugar.
So what should
even in the normal range.
So what should the healthy, really non-risk of dementia later on level be in a fasting blood sugar?
Well, the notion of 90 to 100, I think, including up into the 100, 105 range is wrong. I think we do see plenty of more supportive research these days. I think keeping your blood sugar in the upper 80s, and perhaps more importantly, keeping your A1C at around 5.2 to 5.3, and keeping your fasting insulin level below 8 are really, I believe, the ideal broad strokes. And now, getting back to personalized medicine discussion that we had earlier, that might vary in some people who perhaps glycate their proteins a little bit more and might just have a higher A1C for whatever reason. But I think we have to move away from the notion of blood values being in the normal range, because that means what is average. And I don't want anybody I'm interacting with to be average. I want them to have optimal health, the very, very best. So I'm not going to tell them that, you want your vitamin D between 30 and 90 because that's the normal range. No. I want your vitamin D level around 80 or 90. That's optimal. I want your blood sugar in the upper 80s to low 90s. That's better than 105, even though most doctors would say, hey, blood sugar 105, you're fine. Right. You don't have diabetes with the word yet hanging in the background.
I remember Churaskin was one of the first. You remember Emanuel Churaskin? He would say, forget the recommended daily allowance. Let's go to the ideal daily allowance so that you can really have optimal health. That makes a lot of sense. So, I am a DES daughter, as you said before, meaning my mother was given that drug when she was pregnant. And they've now done 33 and almost close to 40-year follow-ups, and we have damaged insulin receptors. So I live very mindfully, but keeping my fasting blood sugar and all of my correct sugar levels optimal is really difficult for me. And we're going to talk more about the ketogenic diet to help us achieve that. But I have a question, if we can backtrack, if you don't mind, a few sentences. So are you saying if all of us have a postprandial after meal inflammatory response from consuming that croissant or that cookie or that pasta that's made from wheat, are you saying that gluten is good to give up for everybody?
Yep. How do you like that? And I don't make a huge number of friends by making a statement like that. Then again, I do. Because so many people, and when I say so many, I mean tens of thousands of people who write to us and post on our website have told us that they had X, Y, or Z for so many years, saw so many doctors, and nothing happened until they went gluten-free. Recently there was an article published that was spun by mainstream media, and the mainstream spun it to say that gluten-free is going to give you a heart attack and you're going to die. That's a bit extreme, but the message was that there was an increased risk of heart disease in people going gluten-free. And as a matter of fact, the study from the BMJ journal indicated that that was true, and I think their conclusions were correct. The authors correctly indicated that what they found in subjects going gluten-free is they abandoned fiber from their diet, whether it was gluten-free or contained gluten. When they went gluten-free, they dramatically reduced their fiber intake, and that sets the stage for inflammatory issues like heart disease. So, gluten-free, terrific, but the caveat, make sure you don't cut out dietary fiber, which you desperately need. It's like saying, being vegan is a good diet, provided you get enough vitamin D, vitamin B12, and you're getting adequate amounts of protein. So certain things have to happen when you adopt a certain dietary plan to make sure that you don't, create more problems because of things that you would necessarily exclude.
So can you tell us, one, if you're ketogenic, how do you go ketogenic and still get good fiber in your diet? Because fiber feeds all the cells that line your intestinal tract, like your colonocytes.
With all due respect,
yeah,
the type of fiber that you want to be consuming on a ketogenic diet is prebiotic fiber.
Okay.
And by definition, it is not used by your physiology at all. Prebiotic fiber is exclusively used by your gut bacteria. So you don't gain calories, you don't gain sugar by consuming prebiotic fiber. It doesn't, if anything, it helps with metabolism and it helps regulate your blood sugar through the action of upregulating these pathways in these bacteria.
But don't the bacteria then make short-chain fatty acids that give food to the cells that line the intestinal tract?
To some degree, yes. Specifically, butyrate being one of those short-chain fatty acids. It is not as if these short-chain fatty acids represent the lion's share of metabolic fuel for cells, though they do to some degree, especially the colonocyte itself. But elsewhere in the body, these short-chain fatty acids are used as fuel, but less significantly so. But it takes us to one of the real beauties of the ketogenic diet per se, and that is it shifts the body away from relying upon glucose as a fuel source to using fat or fat derivatives as a fuel source. In this case, what are called the ketone bodies.
So can you explain what the ketone bodies are and then maybe give us an example? Are you living a ketogenic diet?
I am. Like yourself, I have a bit of a family history that puts me at risk. Having lost my father to Alzheimer's disease, I know that I'm at risk for that. And therefore, I fully believe that being in low-grade ketosis is the right thing for me and good for my brain. So that's the reason I popularized this idea and talk about it, and as well engage in this diet personally. So it's really a diet that's not involved with sugar at all, that has very low carbohydrates, with the exception of fiber being. That's why we have the notion of net carbs, when we subtract out those carbohydrates that are derived from fiber. And basically, it's shifting your body's metabolism away from carbs and into the use of these ketone bodies, where dietary fat and body fat pass through the liver and are modified in the liver in such a way as to then create these three ketone bodies, perhaps the most important of which is beta-hydroxybutyrate, that then is used as a fuel source in various cells of your body and acts as what we call a signaling molecule to enhance antioxidant production and reduce inflammation.
What about fruit?
Well, I think fruit is a good food to have in its whole form, as opposed to fruit juice. A glass of orange juice contains 36 grams of sugar.
Right, I saw that on your blog. That was very interesting, yeah.
And, that's not a natural way of consuming an orange. I'm not saying you should eat the peeling of an orange, But to have an apple a day is a good idea, but to have 4 to 6 servings of fruit is not reasonable. I mean, that's a huge sugar spike.
So can you give us an example of what a typical day of food might be for you to eat? I know we're coming close to a close here.
Sure. And again, this gets to the personalized medicine part of the story, but I generally don't eat in the morning. So I don't eat after dinner, and then I might have a big breakfast / lunch at anywhere around 1 or 2 o'clock, and then that's it. So then I've extended this fast from dinner time at least 12, 14, 16 hours. And the more you do it, the better you feel. I don't do it to lose weight. That's not been an issue for me since middle school, when it really was an issue for me. I went to Weight Watchers as a kid. But I think it does help maintain body weight. And, one recent study that came out in the journal Neurology, 2 things I'll talk about before we close, showed first that one of the most powerful markers or biomarkers that you can use to determine Alzheimer's risk is very sophisticated. It's called a tape measure, and simply means measure a person's belly. The bigger the belly, the greater is the risk of Alzheimer's. I mean,
bigger the belly, the smaller the brain, right?
Brain scans looking for beta amyloid, etc. Just the size of your visceral fat is a powerful marker. And the other thing I'll mention is how very delighted I was that last week, the lead article in the Journal of the American Medical Association was a validation of the utility of the ketogenic diet for diabetes and also for weight loss. Lead article in JAMA. What a world.
Wow. So I was at the A4M lecture. I was one of the speakers in the Gut Symposium, and there was a functional gastroenterologist from Los Angeles who said when he was doing scoping on patients that were long-term ketogenic dieters, he was seeing a little excess inflammation, and he didn't know if that was due to the diet or it was still the issue that they had before they started the diet that they were healing.
I would say that it isn't surprising, because I think a lot of people on the ketogenic diet, or a number of people on the ketogenic diet, make the mistake that we talked about earlier, and that is they're not getting enough fiber, and fiber is key.
What's your
If you're
favorite
gonna nurture
fibers?
your gut bacteria, you've got to make sure you're getting adequate amounts of fiber, and that is specifically prebiotic fiber that you can get by eating chicory root, dandelion greens, onions, garlic, leeks, etc. Or you go to the health food store and you buy it as a powder, and you sprinkle it on your food or in your drink.
Boy, everyone who knows me knows I love to get green dandelion leaves, wash them, dry them well, keep them in my vegetable bin, and instead of having chips, I love to munch on really crisp dandelion greens. And then I love organic raw green banana flour. I just love that green banana flour. You can buy it even at my local grocery, and I put a little bit in water before I go to bed at night. But one of the researchers that I really love was the gentleman, Dr. Neurology, who discovered the BRCA genes, that are the genes that give you an increased risk over 80% from a woman who doesn't have those genes of getting breast cancer and other cancers. And he discovered that if people ate too much, just if they had more than 2,300 calories a day, those genes were more at risk of expressing versus if people underate. So you're really talking about eating smarter and eating less.
That's right. And last week I interviewed from USC Dr. Walter Longo, and he is involved in research right now looking at changing the destiny of women with the BRCA gene by intervening, not by doing a bilateral mastectomy, rather by putting them on a diet that mimics fasting. So you're exactly right. We can change genetic destiny with dietary manipulation. And the idea of fasting has been with us for a long, long time. We're just beginning to understand mechanistically what may be going on there.
When I was a yoga teacher and I lived in India many years ago, when the Beatles came back from visiting with the Maharishi, I had to jump on a plane and go to India. And a big part of being a really authentic, not just a westernized, contemporized yogini, is eating less. And as Americans, we eat more and we sit more, and that combination is just lethal. So I love your idea of being mindful of how you live, because you can really change your genetic destiny.
I'm with you, and it takes us full circle in our conversation today to the place of where you and I grew up thinking that genes were our destiny, locked in a glass case and being very deterministic, to an opportunistic perspective that genes may represent a predisposition, but in no way are they indicative of what your health destiny may be. But that's very empowering, and I think it raises our level of responsibility as consumers to make choices, and as physicians to do our very best to talk about those lifestyle changes that can offset genetic predisposition.
And as parents, to be a better mirrors, because your kids are your biggest mirrors. So if they see you overeating, especially late at night, sitting more, eating more, they get that wired in their brain. I just love what you're talking about. It's so powerful and so authentic.
I appreciate being able to spend time with you today. It's been a great time together. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And everybody, if you go to my website, drlindseyberkson.com, you can sign up for my blogs. I'm going to write a really great blog based on this show. So if you sign up for free, you get delivered to your computer while you're in your jammies. You can enjoy radio shows like this, and you can enjoy blogs. And also, I have a bunch of new courses coming out that are really cutting edge information. For example, like the unknown role of estrogen in brain plasticity. Your brain produces estrogen in about 6 different anatomical parts because it has so much to do with your epigenetic capabilities of what we've just been talking about, your methylation capabilities, and even your mitochondrial robustness and protection against damage. There is so much new information coming down the pike, but there's very few people like Dr. David right here with us today that have been living it, influencing other physicians with this, writing books that are translated into 30 languages. So many people are getting the memo, and we get to have him today. I was so excited to have you on. You're like an iconic hero of mine,
Well, thank
David.
you so much. I enjoy being with you.
And it's so great to see somebody who looks so healthy and sparkles from inside out. And Carol said, you get along super with your wife and your kids. And to have an office that runs like butter, a functional medicine office is very difficult to orchestrate. And she said you did. So it made me realize that you have your life very organized and you really do walk your talk. And so,
that's for sure.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Okay, well, bye for now. Thank you.
Okay, blessings. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.